Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for today's video. It is going to be my introduction to my 2022 palettes on their Last Hoorah. This was a series I started last year and I was pretty successful in decluttering at least I think like 10 to 15 palettes throughout the course of the year. The last 3 months of 2021 were a bit chaotic for me and I kind of like lost track of basically like all of my projects, so I didn't necessarily even wrap up my 2021 series, but I thought we would just kick it off and start a new palettes on their Last Hoorah series for 2022. This has kind of like morphed into almost like a chopping block style of series. When I started it last year, I had 10 palettes I was starting with that were palettes that were older in my collection that I wanted to use throughout the course of last year, and then at the end of the year I thought like maybe if I just like dedicated some extra time to these palettes throughout the year, I would feel better about decluttering them at the end of 2021. And then it kind of morphed into like its own like rolling style chopping block. I believe I updated about every 4 months or so, and usually I would declutter a few palettes, add a few in, and again throughout the course of the year I decluttered at least 10 palettes. But then there were a few palettes that I started the year off with. For example, the Master palette by Mario in collaboration with ABH, which truly I need to just declutter, but I cannot get myself to do it. I didn't end up decluttering this by the end of the year. Some palettes I like re-fell in love with. So it was a really fun series for me last year and I'm really excited to do it again. As of right now, I plan to update every 3 months and just kind of use this as like a chopping block style of video, but I'm still gonna call it palettes on their Last Hoorah. Because some of these I truly do, like they need to probably just get decluttered, but we'll just kind of see where this series takes me. If you guys are interested in seeing the 11 palettes I have selected to start the year off with, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project planning content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I would love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. All right guys, first things first, I'm filming like 6 or 7 videos today. I'm moving soon, which I'm super excited about, but want to like give myself time to get like packed and then get settled, and I'm not sure, like I've only been filming like once every 2 weeks, so I want to get all of my introductions filmed. So if you're noticing like my makeup looks the exact same in the next 6 or 7 videos that I post, I just really wanted to get my introductions filmed and ready to go so that they're set, we're ready, and then I'm really excited. Hopefully starting like mid-January I will be back on track with my YouTube channel officially, fingers crossed, hopefully, because I haven't been in the last, 2021 was pretty much just a wash. Anyway, that being said, there was one more thing I wanted to say. What was it? I added some gloss in an attempt to think of what else I wanted to say. I think maybe I was just gonna say I do love palette themed content, so I'll have my palette playlist down below in case you too like eyeshadow palette content, and then I'll also leave linked last year's palettes on their Last Hoorah playlist, and then I'll just include these in that playlist as well. Anyway, let's get into it, you guys. I have a couple of palettes that are carryovers from last year. I think just 2. I'm going to be carrying over my ABH Master palette by Mario. Truly, at the end of this year, I need to declutter this palette because this is way too old, but there's just something so special, like, and near and dear to my heart in regards to this palette. I truly cannot get myself to declutter this one, so I'm gonna try and get a ton of use out of this. I would love to use this like 30 to 50 times before the end of 2022, and then it really will be time to say goodbye. And if in 2023 I'm trying to argue that I'm gonna keep this palette, you guys need to like come after me in the comments, okay? Okay. And then I'm also going to include my Tarte Love, Trust, and Fairy Dust palette. This is like, I've had this for a while. I really should probably think about decluttering this, but the quality on this is still good. I would love to get more use out of like the mauves on this side. I do have a couple of pans already in this palette. This palette is like chipping at the bottom. We've had like some casualties in some of the shadows, but I would like to at least, like if I could hit pan in at least 2 to 3 more shades in this palette, I feel like maybe I would feel a little bit better about decluttering it. But this is one that I included as well last year. Used it a ton and just cannot get myself to declutter it. In my updates, I will share with you guys every like 3 months how many times I've used the palette and try and use that as a benchmark of whether or not I should keep some of these. Like if I'm not using them and they're in this series, maybe it's time to declutter them a little bit sooner than the end of the year. So that brings us to the other 9 eyeshadow palettes that are like new to this series for this year. So this one brings me great pain, but my Huda Beauty Smokey Obsessions palette is getting very old in my collection. This is a palette that I have raved about so much on this channel. I've used this palette so much, and it's a palette that I find myself not reaching for frequently anymore, just because I know you can't really get your hands on this palette anymore, and for some reason I like want to reserve it for special occasions, which is just so silly. So I thought I would include this in this series to kind of give me a boost of motivation to reach for this palette a little bit more. I do have a shattered shade up here, but I do love this eyeshadow palette. I think it's beautiful. I have no pans in this palette actually, so I'd love to see some pan in this palette by the end of the year. I could see myself come end of 2022, if I've used this a ton, I could see myself not decluttering this, but we'll see. We'll see. Next, I have this one from Pat McGrath. This was my first Pat McGrath eyeshadow palette, and I was super excited to get my hands on this. And I will say I was like a little bit let down by this palette, mostly because this blue was like the star of the show and why I wanted to purchase this eyeshadow palette, and it was a little bit of a letdown. I do, however, love these 2 shades right here, and I like that you do have like the matte browns that really kind of work for every day. This shade right here I haven't used a whole ton. This is mostly like chopping block style for this. This isn't necessarily like I feel like I'll use it for this year and then declutter at the end of the year, but I want to like give myself the motivation to use it and see if I actually do use it and how I'm feeling about it, and then kind of decide whether or not I want to declutter this one or keep it in my collection. But this is just not getting enough use right now, and it was like one of those palettes where as I look through my collection and consider eyeshadow palettes to potentially declutter, this is one I'm always like, should I? No, but then I don't reach for it even though I'm like, no, I shouldn't declutter it. So I wanted to include that one. Next up, I have the Too Faced Palm Springs Dreams eyeshadow palette. This is one that I do have a pan in right up here. I hit pan, I believe, in this shadow last year, but after I hit pan in that eyeshadow, I have not reached for this palette since. I do think there's some pretty shades in this palette, but it's just not a palette I find myself excited to reach for. So I wanted to just include this in the series and see if it gave me, like if I fell in love with it and decided I want to keep it, or if I'll be ready to say goodbye to that one. A palette that's getting older in my collection that I think like no matter what I should declutter, but then I could also see myself using it a ton and deciding not to, is my Color Grain Queen of Hearts eyeshadow palette. This is what this one looks like. This was all the rage. So this was all the rage a couple of years ago. And I actually ended up purchasing it like much later than like when it was super popular. And I really enjoyed this right when I first got it, but found that I was not reaching for this much at all last year until it was included in one of my project pans. And then after I hit pan, you can't really tell, but I do have a pan on this shade right here. After I hit pan on that, I just found myself not really like motivated to reach for this one anymore again. So I kind of want to see like where my feelings are at with this palette. I do love the shades. Like I feel like the formula is really nice. I just don't get excited about this color story or just like this palette in general. So that's why I selected this one. This next one is another one that's old dirt in my collection, but it's gonna be super painful and super hard to actually convince myself to declutter this. It's the Natasha Denona Lila palette. It was my first Natasha Denona eyeshadow palette, so it does also hold a spot near and dear to my heart, which is why I feel like I would have a very tough time decluttering this. I've also created some looks with this eyeshadow palette that I absolutely adore and are some of my favorite looks that I've ever created ever. But I also find myself not reaching for this palette just because it's more expensive, and again, I feel like for some reason I have to reserve it for special occasions. So I have heard people say like their Natasha Denona shadows sometimes turn a little bit quickly or dry out. I haven't had any issues with the quality in any of these. I love this bottom row of like metallics or shimmers. I think is absolutely stunning. I will say I feel like I often have to reach into another palette for some additional mattes just because these are a little deeper and a little more cool toned than I typically prefer, and usually when I reach into this palette I'm just reaching into it for a shimmer shade, but I want to play around with this palette some more, and I thought this would be a great one to include in this series. And then the final 4 palettes are not necessarily like the oldest palettes in my collection, but they're palettes that I feel like in my head I really like, but then I reflect on how many times I used each eyeshadow palette last year and I'm like, do I even really need these in my collection? So up first I have this one from Nabla. This is the Secret palette, and I want to say this may have been the first Nabla palette that I ever purchased. I really loved purple and greens like 2 years ago, I believe, when I purchased this. Maybe it was 3 years ago. So I loved having this palette around for these two shades, and I just do not find myself reaching into this palette. So I feel like I need to use it on more of a consistent basis to kind of give me an idea on whether or not I need to keep this palette. Although you guys do know I do love Nabla so much, so I feel like I probably won't end up decluttering this, but we'll see. If I use it more frequently, maybe I'll just decide this one just really isn't my jam, and I have plenty of other Nabla palettes and Nabla products in my collection. Next, I have the Dominique Cosmetics Latte palette. I did not reach for this palette at all in 2021, and it's such an easy palette to reach for because it's just basically a neutral palette with a couple of pops. So I'm questioning why I didn't reach for it, especially because I do like this formula and have talked highly about this palette before. It just did not happen to be a palette that I ended up reaching for at all last year. So I want to pressure myself to use this, and then if I still don't use it, it's time to declutter that. Next up, I have this one from Marc Jacobs. Marc Jacobs is no longer, or rebranding or something. So this is no longer available, and I believe this was limited edition when it released anyway. It is their iconic, one of their iconic palettes in the shade Electric. And this is what it looks like. I do have an eyeshadow pan in this shade right here. This was going in a Pan Those eyeshadows. And then after I hit pan on that shadow, I feel like I never reached for this palette again. Although I really do like these three shades, these like metallic shimmer shades. They're so beautiful. And this palette is really fun and beautiful if you're looking to do a more cool toned look. I just do not find myself motivated to reach for this. So I wanted to include it and decide whether or not I should keep it. And then finally, my last palette is another palette that I did not reach for at all last year, and it is the ABH Amrezy eyeshadow palette. I remember being so excited to get this palette. I remember it being so excited to create looks with this palette when I first purchased it, and then I feel like after I used it a bunch right in the beginning, I stopped reaching for this palette altogether. I feel like I did reach for this last year. Like, I'm looking at this feeling like I remember reaching into this palette, but when I look at my spreadsheet, it does not look like I did. So I just want to see if I can re-fall in love with this. I do really love some of the fun like pinks in here, like the shade Barb. I feel like I could not get rid of this palette for this shade alone. And there's some obviously very easy to work with, just like everyday neutral browns. I just don't find myself reaching for this palette. So I wanted to kind of put this in as a chopping block sort of item and make a decision down the road. But those are the 11 palettes that are going to be in this introduction of my palettes on their Last Hoorah. I would love your comments down below. What palettes, are there any palettes you for sure see me decluttering? Are there any palettes that you're like, girl, why are you considering that? Like, you need to keep that. I would love your feedback down below. And if there's anything else you want me to include in my updates, I'll share pictures. Like, I'll take pictures of all these eyeshadow palettes right now, and I'll share update pictures as we progress throughout this series so we can kind of see what my visual usage looks like. And then I'll also share how many times I use these eyeshadow palettes. But if you'd like to see anything else from this series, please do let me know in the comments down below. But that is going to wrap it up for today's video. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch. I love you so much. Appreciate your support as always, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.